Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, dig in, and pull out the essential insights just for you.
Hello.
Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating, slightly chaotic mix of stuff: literary criticism, philosophical speculations, satire, even a couple of wild, fantastical short stories.
Yeah, that's quite a bundle.
It's all wrapped up in the literary remains of a fictional author named George Boon, supposedly presented by someone named Reginald Bliss, but with a very, ambiguous introduction from none other than H.G. Wells.
Right. And that ambiguity is key from the start.
Our mission today is to navigate these layers: who is saying what's serious, what's satire, and uncover the surprising ideas hidden within about writing, fame, collective thought, and just trying to make sense of a world that feels like it's spinning out of control.
It's a look back at how some early 20th century minds wrestled with information overload and the purpose of art, but yet filtered through this lens that's part serious probe, part elaborate joke.
Let's jump in.
Okay, let's untangle this layered structure right at the top, because it's kind of crucial to everything that follows.
Definitely.
The source material is presented as the literary remains of George Boon, put together by a guy named Reginald Bliss. But before you even get to Boon or Bliss, H.G. Wells steps in with this introduction that immediately feels, well, cagey.
It does. Wells calls Bliss's potential book indiscreet, ill-advised, and he's practically wringing his hands, suspecting the introduction is a trap specifically designed to rope him, H.G. Wells, into taking responsibility for whatever wild ideas are in the book.
Yeah, he's really trying to distance himself.
He makes a point of insisting that readers and reviewers need to keep H.G. Wells and Mr. Reginald Bliss completely separate.
And that's where the playful complexity begins. We're told we're reading Boon through Bliss, but Wells, who's supposedly just introducing Bliss, is already casting doubt on both.
Right.
It sets up this immediate sense that we need to be skeptical, that nothing here is quite face value. It perfectly mirrors the themes we'll see emerge about public facades versus private realities.
Exactly. So who is this George Boon we're meant to be diving into? On the surface, he's a massive success.
Yeah.
We're told he's a best-selling author in the 100,000 class in America, churning out novels that are described as good-humored and grammatical and a little distinguished in an inoffensive way.
Very safe, very palatable. He was perfectly adapted to the enormous antebellum public that's the huge reading audience before World War I.
But here's the first big surprise, the core nugget about Boon. He had this ingenious secret.
Yes, he never actually wrote a single word for his public with his own hand.
Amazing.
He used an amanuensis, essentially a secretary who wrote from dictation, a woman named Miss Bathwick. But she wasn't just typing, she was acting as a human filter.
A filter. How?
When his thoughts veered into territory that wasn't safe or palatable for his mass audience, she would perform a strategic cough, or a sigh, or even just get up and leave the room.
A strategic cough. That sounds like a remarkably passive-aggressive yet effective way to keep his profitable brand safe from his own underlying freakishness.
Exactly. It was his ingenious device, as the text calls it.
So this publicly adored author was in fact outsourcing his acceptable thoughts through a filter. What did this intriguing figure even look like?
Apparently, not at all like you'd expect a charming bestseller to look. He wasn't photogenic.
Oh.
He had an enigmatical face, rosy rotundities, kind of plump, but with very bright, active eyes and queer, wiry black hair. The description points out that he made a clear, solid impression only on those who hadn't actually met him. His physical presence, like his creative process, seemed designed to mask his true self.
So his public image was a carefully constructed performance. What about those private thoughts, the ones Miss Bathwick's coughs were designed to suppress? What were they like?
Oh, much less polite. We see glimpses of a prolonged, faint jeering at people, including H.G. Wells himself. Hugely disrespectful internal commentary about other famous literary figures.
Like who?
Well, Conrad, for one, and even dark imagined scenarios like murdering critics or abducting them and shipping them off to sinister locations.
Goodness, that's
Yeah.
intense.
Right. He also harbored this deep-seated fear of the American public, the source of his great wealth and fame. He personified it as Aunt Columbia or Aunt Dove.
Aunt Dove.
Yeah, seeing this public as a vain, garrulous, and prosperous female with an unpredictable temper, prone to hysterics. He constantly worried some stray thought or opinion might upset Aunt Dove and end his success there.
That fear sounds almost paralyzing, especially for someone who made his fortune writing for that very public.
Absolutely.
The planned novel called Aunt Dove, described as featuring a wealthy spinster lecturing a village, really seems like a satirical jab at this perception, a way of him privately mocking the audience he publicly courted.
For sure. A bit of revenge, maybe.
Yet the irony is American press cuttings spoke of him in quasi-amorous tones, totally unaware of his private disdain.
Exactly. The contrast between the adoring public reception and his internal, often hostile, private world is stark.
And this extended to other writers, too.
Yeah, he was sympathetic to new, struggling writers, but seemed to genuinely dislike figures who had achieved conspicuous, respectable success, like Joseph Conrad. It wasn't just about the writing, but about the system of fame itself.
Interesting. Okay, this brings us to the grand projects Boon talked about incessantly, but for which very little actual writing exists. The Mind of the Race and The Wild Asses of the Devil.
Right. We're told he spoke about these constantly, yet what Bliss found were mostly fragments, notes, drawings, sketches, not finished manuscripts.
Which is pretty significant, isn't it?
Hugely significant, because these were the places where his true, unfiltered, freakish thoughts were supposed to live. They represent his serious intellectual explorations, distinct from the safe, profitable novels filtered by Ms. Bathwick.
So the lack of finished work? Maybe the ideas were just too big, too messy.
Perhaps too sprawling, too chaotic, or too overwhelming even for his private mind to fully contain. Or maybe he just liked talking about them more than writing them.
Let's try and grapple with the first one. The Mind of the Race. What was this ambitious, fragmented concept trying to get at?
Okay, the core idea, as Boon envisioned it, is a collective human overmind. It's something distinct from individual wills, individual reasoning, individual lifetimes.
An overmind, like a hive mind.
Sort of, but maybe more philosophical.
Yeah.
He saw it as a synthesis of all the individual instances, but crucially, something more than their algebraic sum. It was a sort of subconscious mind with a half-instinctive will.
That's pretty abstract.
It is. He even personified these great overminds, suggesting they might clothe themselves in separate languages and were outside the cycles of birth, death, and sex that define individual lives.
So he saw things in the world as expressions of this mind.
Exactly. He looked at things like wars, cities, roads, and even styles of architecture, like a Gothic cathedral, and saw them not just as human creations, but as manifestations of this larger collective entity.
Wow. And did everyone buy into this?
Oh, definitely not. Right away, the source introduces skepticism, often through a character named Dodd, who dismisses the concept as a fantastic notion, crying mysticism and insisting on the solid ground of the rock of fact.
So internal debate from the get-go.
Yes, this immediate internal debate shows that even within Boon's own imagined world, this was a contentious, hard-to-grasp idea.
Boon saw a big difference between this collective mind in his day compared to earlier eras, like, say, Goldsmith's time.
Yeah, he noted the enormous range and volume of intellectual activity happening then versus what he saw as a jejune trickle back in the 18th century. More information, more thought, but maybe more chaos, too.
And he planned to introduce figures into his work to embody these ideas.
Right. Like Hallery, presented as a fanatic, crying out that the thought of a nation is the life of a nation. Boon intended Hallery to be a voice pushing against what Boon perceived as an intellectual barrenness of the time. He called it a great slump.
This slump was characterized by what people just not thinking.
Pretty much. A preference for activities like playing bridge over engaging in creative or intellectual pursuits. The encyclopedist view describes this period as intellectually barren, even suggesting an academy dedicated to uncreative literature.
An academy for uncreative literature? That's satire right there.
Peak Boon satire. To explore these ideas further, he imagined a conference setting, directly referencing Malick's famous satirical novel, The New Republic, which gathered prominent figures in a garden setting to debate philosophy.
Ah, okay. So who was at Boon's garden party?
Boon populated his imagined garden with recognizable figures of his day, Goss, Colvin, Mumchance, and with typical satirical flair had Mr. Orridge, a real literary figure known for his magazine, The New Age, throwing unpleasant missiles from outside the wall.
Literally throwing things.
Figuratively, one assumes, or maybe literally, representing those excluded from the mainstream literary establishment.
So the central debate he envisioned there was about how intellectual life should function. Old versus new.
Exactly. The old, perhaps elitist, aristocratic country house style of debating ideas was contrasted with a call for something wider, more public, like the large scientific British Association meetings.
The argument being, science had left the mansion, gone public.
Literature and thought needed to follow. There was even an American voice, a Hearst representative, suggesting a massive conference in San Francisco with exhibits on sound American lines, clearly mocking the American approach Boon feared.
Okay, and this is where Boone really lets loose with his literary critiques. I heard there was a big one on Henry James.
Oh, yeah. One of the most detailed attacks is on Henry James, a giant of literature at the time, known for his intricate psychological novels.
What was Boone's beef with James?
Boon argued that James's novels, in seeking unity like a picture, ended up omitting huge chunks of life's diversity and entertainment. His selection of detail was just omission, leaving out messy, vital things like lust, war, elections, even poker. Apparently. According to Boon, James's characters fixated on petty residuum and mere suspicion, missing the bigger picture of life.
And there's parody.
Oh, is there ever? The source includes this absolutely brilliant paragraph-by-paragraph parody of a fictional Jane Vision novel set in Samphire House.
Samphire House, okay.
Featuring characters with very Jamesy names like Blandish, Deshman, and Mutimer, all searching for a mysterious presence.
And what's the punchline?
The climax, described in agonizing detail typical of James's later style, reveals the great treasure they find is just buried 1813 brandy, and the mysterious presence is simply the butler, Mutimer, dead in the cellar from drinking it.
Oh my goodness, that is savage.
It's a total stand-up, a highly specific satirical jab at what Boon saw as the triviality and over-subtlety of James's later work. It perfectly encapsulates Boon's frustration with a certain kind of literature he found detached from the messy reality of life.
This sense of chaos and congestion in contemporary literary life was also captured in another planned scene, the literary conference train.
Yes, this is such a vivid image. Boon imagined a train packed with many of the most prominent writers of the day, figures like Shaw, famous for his plays, Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan, even the controversial D.H. Lawrence.
Quite a passenger list.
Ford Mannix Hufer, referred to satirically as Only Uncle, plus Mackenzie, Sinclair, Hardy, Walpole, the Chestertons, Baring, Belloc, a real who's who.
And what happens on the train? Deep debates.
Not really. He peppered this scene with satirical jokes about them, Mackenzie with excess luggage, Sinclair wrapped in blankets. The scene itself was less about deep ideas and more about portraying the sheer chaos, congestion, and disorder. Boonfeld characterized the literary world he inhabited.
So just a snapshot of the messy scene. He also circled back to his critique of the American literary atmosphere, right?
He did, calling it a spinster atmosphere. Terrified of babies or anything alive, a festival in honor of sterility.
Ouch.
Yeah. He felt American critics judged by external, sometimes irrelevant standards, and lacked the intellectual pluck to genuinely praise American writers.
But then someone challenges this whole mind of the race thing. Wilkins.
Right. The character Wilkins steps in, offering a direct challenge. He questions if it's just a feudal fancy of a gentleman of leisure, essentially a self-indulgent idea, a byproduct.
So what's the real mind, according to Wilkins?
He argues that the real mind isn't literary or philosophical, but the brute historical forces that actually shape the world, setting examples like Macedonian military power, actions, not ideas.
And Wilkins also takes aim at the content of modern thought itself.
Yes, beyond just its organization or literary expression, he uses examples like Schopenhauer's bizarre racism claiming white people are bleached Hindus.
Seriously?
That's what's cited. Houston Stewart Chamberlain's theories of Teutonic supremacy, each are presenting the fairly obvious idea that man is not final as some profound revelation, and Bernard Shaw's spouting style, wild assertions, and what Wilkins saw as indigestion of ideas just regurgitating half-digested concepts.
So basically calling out pseudo-intellectualism.
Pretty much. He contrasts this with the patient evidence-gathering methods of giants like Darwin and Huxley, arguing that the mind of the race has failed to assimilate modern complexity, leading to this kind of confused, ill-supported pronouncements passing as profound thought.
So the central debate becomes, is this collective mind progressing or is it actually falling apart?
Exactly. Is the current state just indigestion, a temporary phase, or is it a more fundamental failure, attacking truth and open order? Wilkins clearly leans towards blank ignorance and sheer misconception.
But Boon, he still held out hope for it.
It seems so. Despite his own sharp critiques, Boon seems almost desperate to believe in the progressive power of this collective mind. He insists that even if most of humanity is out of touch with it, lost to it, that doesn't diminish the importance or existence of the truth held by this mind.
A kind of hopeful, perhaps naive counterpoint to Wilkins' cynicism.
You could say that, yeah.
Moving to another planned section, Boon envisioned one dedicated to poemetry, the art of measuring reputations. Sounds intriguing.
It was a very cynical look at how literary fame is manufactured.
How so?
He included historical examples, tracing the concept of building reputations from ancient ancestor worship right up to the 19th century obsession with great men.
And he had a recipe for greatness.
Kind of a cynical checklist. The source lists the factors needed. Minimal literary work so you don't mess up your image with too many actual books.
Wait, minimal work?
Yep. A marked personality, no unpopular vices, persistent advocacy from others, a good publisher, a good dose of luck, and crucially, an uncritical public.
That's bleak.
Very. It observes a perceived decline in the output of greatness in the late Victorian and early 20th century.
Why was that, according to Boon?
The reasons given. A larger, more dispersed, less uniform public, increased competition for attention from politicians, like Gladstone, Roosevelt, and royalty, like the Kaiser, and the resulting need for more and more flagrant advertisement, citing figures like Hall Caine, who were masters of self-promotion.
So fame became harder to manufacture.
Or required cruder methods. The fascinating takeaway here is the view that the perceived return of writers to a kind of decent obscurity is actually presented as an unmixed blessing.
A blessing. How?
The argument is that the world is now simply too large for the old methods of creating and sustaining literary greatness. As long as good writing is still appreciated, perhaps fame itself is an outdated concept for authors.
Wow. A really sharp, even depressing analysis of the literary marketplace.
Absolutely.
And then, just as Boon is wrestling with all these ideas about mind, culture, and fame, everything changes.
World War I begins. The entire tone of the work shifts dramatically. What starts as theoretical discussions about intellectual slumps and collective consciousness suddenly becomes immediate, grim reality.
How did the war hit Boon's thinking?
Well, the war initially feels like a vast burlesque, almost absurd, but it quickly becomes clear it's the end of an age.
And The Wild Asses of the Devil, that other unwritten project.
Suddenly takes on a terrifying, immediate meaning. It becomes the perfect, terrifying illusion for the destructive forces kicking Europe to splinters, particularly aggressive militarism, which Boon personifies as a crowned wild ass.
The crowned wild ass. That's quite an image.
And Boon's despair at this point is raw and palpable. He cries out, "The new world is killed. We go back 10,000 years."
Total disillusionment.
Completely. He looks around, sees the destruction, and questions where the supposedly great mind of our race is in the face of overwhelming German military strength. He dismisses contemporary English letters as a failed flying scud of paper scraps, utterly ineffective against the real forces shaping the world.
He doubts whether thought even matters anymore.
He desperately doubts if thought, if wit, if intellect is strong enough to counter brute force.
And he directed this anger at specific targets.
Oh, yes. He specifically targets what he sees as reactionary papers like the Morning Post and Spectator, which seem to embody the destructive spirit, appearing to detest all fine creation, all beauty, all novelty, all frank, generous, and pleasant things. Strong words.
He labels them as representing ugliness, dullness, and restriction. And Mr. E.B. Osborne, a real journalist of the time, is presented as the living embodiment of this reactionary spirit.
How so?
Osborne praised war and Spartan ideals and seemed to actively hate free art and thought. Boon's satire here is viciously personal, including caricatures of Osborne singing hymns about his swords, swiping at a statue of St. Francis, doing a war dance, and dreaming of being a Prussian Spartan.
Wow, really going after him.
These aren't subtle critiques. They're direct, furious attacks born of wartime despair.
And the debate with Wilkins, the skeptic, continues into the war.
It does, but now the stakes are existential. Wilkins tries to find some silver lining, hoping the war might lead to graver thought or even a released world after the destruction.
And Boon isn't buying it.
Not at all. Boon is utterly pessimistic. War is just the killing and smashing, he says, seeing no potential for growth, only regression. He fears civilization must essentially start over, but now with a heavier load of destruction and disillusionment.
So for him, the wild asses are just loose, irrevocably loose and uncontrollable. The forces of unreason, violence, and reaction.
And this feeling is captured in a dream he had.
Yes, this sense of defeat for intellect and wit in the face of brute force is powerfully captured in Boon's dream, described in the source. He sees the horrifying wild asses trampling over life and beauty.
Terrifying.
And in his dream, he tries desperately to open his attic salt box, symbolizing his capacity for satire, laughter, sharp intellect to drive them back. But he can't open it.
He's silenced.
The dream symbolizes the crushing weight of the war, silencing his ability to fight back with the very tools he valued most.
And that profound despair seems to lead directly into the final piece presented, the story of the last trump.
Exactly. Bliss presents this as Boone's final fragment, a kind of mocking epitaph on his shattered dream of the mind of the race, reflecting his wartime cynicism and his bleak view of humanity's capacity for change.
How does it start?
It starts with a deliberately whimsical, almost absurd setup. A blessed child in heaven playing accidentally knocks the judgment trumpet down to earth.
Whoops. Where does it land?
Not in some grand cathedral, but in a grubby little shop in London. It's eventually sounded, not by an angel, but by a man named Briggs using a blowpipe, trying to win a bet.
Seriously, a blowpipe?
Yep. This causes worldwide chaos storms, earthquakes, the sea going wild, graves cracking open, sharks floating upside down, and the unmistakable sound of the trumpet is heard everywhere.
Okay, so the world definitely knows something big has happened. How do people react?
And this is the core, cynical point of the story. The first person to see and hear it is an old flower seller. Her profound reaction, it don't mean nothing.
It's dismissed.
Completely ignored. Then we see Mr. Parchester, a fashionable rector. He does perceive the divine light and sound. He feels God's presence, realizes his own hypocrisy and unclean egotism.
So he gets it.
He thinks he does. He rushes out into the street declaring, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand." But he's immediately brushed aside by a policeman dealing with a traffic accident, told point blank, "You aren't being helped, sir."
Oh dear. Reality intrudes.
Brutally. He seeks out his bishop, a figure named Wampatch, expecting spiritual guidance. Instead, the bishop dismisses his intense experience as a delusion, suggests sedatives, and recommends calming reading material like The Life of St. Francis.
The institution can't handle it.
No place for raw divine intervention. Desolate, Parchester turns to a sympathetic female friend, Mrs. Munbridge. She's kind, gives him tea, ministers to him physically.
Offers comfort.
Yes, and gently reinterprets his experience as simply a shared brainwave. Comforted, kissed, and brought back to earth, literally, Parchester returns home, orders a good dinner, and is described as quite restored and ordinary again.
Back to normal. Wow.
This story is the ultimate cynical punchline. It ruthlessly mocks the idea that humanity would be fundamentally changed or even truly notice a divine sign.
People just ignore it or explain it away.
Right. They either dismiss it outright, don't mean nothing, filter it through their own mundane concerns, the policeman, the bishop, or find comfort in rationalizing it away and returning to routine, symbolized by Parchester's decision to simply order a nice meal and go back to being ordinary.
There's a metaphor about rabbits.
Yeah, the powerful, bleak metaphor given in the source is of rabbits glancing at guns but quickly returning to eating lettuce.
We just go back to our routines no matter what.
It suggests that even in the face of potential cosmic truth or impending judgment, humanity is fundamentally self-absorbed, more interested in its immediate comfort and routines than in profound transformation.
And for Boon, this reflected his despair about the war, about the mind of the race.
Exactly. His deepest despair about the mind of the race's inability or perhaps unwillingness to be roused, to perceive truth, or to change, especially when confronted with the overwhelming reality of the war.
And Bliss, the supposed compiler, he's just left with these fragments.
He's left wrestling with all this, trying to assemble these fragmented, contradictory pieces. The successful novelist, the scathing satirist, the hopeful philosopher, the despairing witness to war, the cynical storyteller. He questions what Boone's final message truly was about the mind of the race.
Was it real? Was it something to be built?
Was it a great wisdom that simply exists, or something that must be actively built and becomes? Boone's remains offer no easy answer.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the fascinating, frustrating, and surprisingly relevant world found in the literary remains of George Boon, as presented by H.G. Wells.
Quite a journey through those layers.
We've seen how one mind wrestled with the gap between public image and private thought, the overwhelming nature of information, the challenges facing intellectual life in a chaotic age, and the sheer brutal force of external events like war.
We explored a collective human consciousness that may or may not exist, dissected the cynical mechanics of literary fame, and even witnessed a divine sign utterly shrugged off by humanity.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? If a great universal truth, a clear signal like the sound of a trumpet, were to break through the noise and distraction of our world today, would we even notice?
Or would we just keep scrolling?
Or would we, like the characters in Boone's story, simply dismiss it as meaningless, filter it through our own immediate preoccupations, and ultimately return to our routines? Perhaps just ordering a slightly better dinner.
Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about as you go about your day.